Welcome to 17th century tales, forgotten cavalier stories from the East Midlands Civil War past, recorded in a secret Nottingham Roundhead location. Episode 7, The Fighting Prince, Part 2, Rupert's Ford. After the triumph of the relief of Newark, Prince Rupert was required in the north of England. The north was where much of the king's support came from in the Civil War. The north was under attack from the Roundheads. The city of York was being besieged. Rupert had just relieved the besieged town of Newark and was expected to perform the same miracle in the more important and strategically vital city of York. He'd done it once, he could do it again. But once he'd arrived in Yorkshire, on July the 2nd, 1644, in a matter of 2 hours, Rupert had seen his entire army defeated, had barely gotten away from the battlefield with his life, and would see his unassailable reputation begin its rapid descent. So what happened? Who was to blame? Let's start at the top with the King of England himself. The king had personally ordered Rupert to the north in a letter, and in a time of crisis where clarity and concise commands were of the utmost importance, the king delivered to Rupert perhaps the most fudgily worded, incomprehensible set of orders ever set to paper in a war. A bold claim, perhaps? Well, let me read you the letter and you decide what Rupert was supposed to take away from this. But now I must give you the true state of my affairs, which if their condition be such as enforces me to give you more peremptory commands than I would willingly do, you must not take ill. If York be lost, I shall esteem my crown little less, unless supported by your sudden march to me, and a miraculous conquest in the south before the effects of their northern power can be found here. But if York be relieved, and you beat the rebel army of both kingdoms which are before it, then, but otherwise not, I may make a shift upon the defensive to spin out time until you come to assist me. Wherefore I command and conjure you, by the duty and affection which I know you bear me, that all new enterprises, laid aside, you immediately march according to your first intention, with all your force to that relief of York. But if that be either lost or have freed themselves from the besiegers, or that from want of power you cannot undertake that work, then you must immediately march with your whole strength directly to Worcester to assist me in my army, without which, or you, having relieved York by beating the Scots, all the successes you can afterwards have must infallibly be useless unto me. You may believe that nothing but an extreme necessity could make me write thus unto you, wherefore in this case I can no ways doubt your punctual compliance with your loving and most faithful friend, Charles R. And that's not even the whole letter. I mean, what was Rupert supposed to take from that? Was he supposed to rescue York at all costs, or not attack York if it's too difficult to attack York, and then reinforce the king wherever the king was? You tell me. No, don't tell me. I'll tell you how Rupert interpreted those words. Rescue York and defeat the Roundheads, besieging York at all costs. And that's what Rupert tried to do. I mean, he chased the Roundheads away from York successfully enough. He decided to stay and fight the army that was camped 6 miles outside of York at a place called Marston Moor, despite being outnumbered by his enemies, just to stop them coming back and retaking York once he'd gone, because that's what he believed the king had told him to do. The second reason for Rupert's failure was Rupert himself, or more specifically, Rupert's incredible capacity for rudeness. The royalist commander for the king's armies in the north of England was William Cavendish. You may recall him from a previous episode in this series called Mad Madge, where he featured prominently. He was on his way to reinforce Rupert's army with a few thousand soldiers of his own. He forwarded a letter to Rupert congratulating him on his success in rescuing York from their Roundhead besieging oppressors. Rupert responded with a very rudely worded order, basically telling William Cavendish to hurry up and get on with it and join him. In not taking the time to be polite, Rupert had made a classic error. In fact, he'd made 2 errors. Firstly, he'd insulted one of the richest and most powerful men in the kingdom. And secondly, he'd given an order to William Cavendish as if it were a foregone conclusion that Rupert were in charge of the army. William Cavendish was commander of the armies of the north for the king, for goodness sakes. Rupert gave similarly roughly worded instructions to the Cavalier soldiers in York to get a move on and join him. Rupert had unnecessarily offended his allies. And come the moment of battle, when unity, clear chain of command, and clarity of purpose was of the utmost importance, Rupert would not be able to rely on his military peers, precisely because he didn't consider them his peers, he considered them his inferiors. Third reason that Rupert lost the Battle of Marston Moor and his reputation started to slide into decline was the presence at the battle of Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell was a complete military anomaly. Before the war, he had no military experience whatsoever. At the beginning of the war, he was a relatively unknown politician, the Member of Parliament for Cambridge, who had money problems. When the war commenced, he found he had a natural talent for soldiering, specifically the organisation and deployment of cavalry. Cromwell made an impact early on with his outstanding contribution to the parliamentarians' victory at the Battle of Gainsborough. And in October 1643, the year when the Cavaliers looked like they might win the war, Cromwell delivered Parliament a welcome victory at the Battle of Winceby. Cromwell was also a very strict Puritan, and that was another secret of his success as a soldier. He was disciplined and controlled, and he instilled that in his men, recruiting many Puritans into his ranks. One of Rupert's flaws as a commander was that he never really learned from his mistakes. We'll see examples of that later on in this podcast. Cromwell didn't learn from his mistakes because he didn't really make any, but he learned from other people's mistakes, especially Rupert. We learnt last podcast that one of Rupert's flaws was that he only had one decent cavalry charge in him for battle. Cromwell drilled his own cavalry to keep their discipline after a charge, and then regroup and deliver a second or a third charge if need be. So there we have it, 3 reasons why the battle went so horribly wrong for Rupert. The king's confusing orders, Rupert's own rudeness, and the presence of an authentic military genius on the battlefield in the form of Oliver Cromwell. Let's talk about the battle. Rupert arrived at York and chased the besieging army away. The liberated defenders of York started partying hard in celebration and expected Rupert and his men to join them. Rupert wasn't interested in partying. Actually, he was a teetotaler. I bet that surprises you. And set off in pursuit of the Roundhead army. Catches up with the Roundheads pretty quickly. I mean, they're only 6 miles away, which surprises the Roundheads because they assumed that Rupert, after he'd relieved Newark, was going to go back and reinforce the King's army in Worcester. In spite of Rupert's numerical inferiority, he sees an opportunity to take advantage of the Roundheads' lack of preparation and attack them and rout them in the way that he had surprised the Roundheads at Newark. And this is when he sends his rude message to William Cavendish to hurry up and join him and bring a host of soldiers with him. Rupert expected Cavendish to be there at 4 o'clock in the morning. Cavendish turned up later with a significantly smaller amount of men than Rupert had anticipated. He wanted 10,000 men, he expected 10,000 men, and Cavendish turned up with about 2,500 men, a lot of whom were actually massively hungover from the previous night's hard partying. Cavendish had turned up at 9 o'clock in the morning, so any chance of a surprise dawn raid had gone. Because Newcastle's men were hungover, it took a while to organise them, and then there were disagreements over whether to attack or whether to defend, and Rupert favoured attack, but Cavendish's second in command, who also didn't like Rupert very much, favoured defence. And the bulk of the day was whittled away, allowing the Roundheads to accept the fact there was going to be a battle and prepare to fight. Actually, the case for the Cavaliers staying where they were and defending was a good one. They were in a very strong position with their men in ditches and positioned behind hedgerows. But Rupert did something flabbergasting. He just wrote the day off and decided that he and his men were just going to have tea, which would have been fine if he'd maintained his defensive position, but he didn't. Soldiers left ditches and came out behind hedgerows and just reclined, secure in the fact that the Roundheads would never attack them and the battle would take place next day. Guess what happened at 7 o'clock in the evening? The Roundheads launched their attack and the battle had begun. And as if to announce from the heavens that the age of one great soldier had come to a close and the baton was being passed to the next generation of military genius in the form of Oliver Cromwell, a thunderstorm could be heard as his men launched their first assault. Oliver Cromwell's cavalry vaulted the ditch and crashed into the right wing of Rupert's cavalry. One of Rupert's officers, Lord Byron, manages to get his cavalry in front of his own musketeers who can't support them for fear of shooting Byron and his own men, and Byron's cavalry is chopped to pieces by Cromwell. Prince Rupert gets over his shock and surprise, gets off his backside and starts organising the second line of the right wing of his cavalry, who are running away. He gets his men back on their horses, and then it's Rupert versus Cromwell, the fight of the ages. And it is a tough fight, and Rupert and his men give good account of themselves for a while, but eventually they are overwhelmed, and Rupert is, not for the first time in his military career, it has to be said, separated from his men and forced to hide in a bean field for his own protection, and is out of the battle for the rest of the fighting. But elsewhere on the battlefield, the Cavalier horse are doing quite well against the cavalry of the Puritan soldier Sir Thomas Fairfax, who barely escapes with his life. And then the Cavaliers, in typical Cavalier fashion, just at the moment they're doing really well, see an unprotected baggage train and think, hello, I'm going to loot that. And around about this point, Oliver Cromwell manages to achieve what Rupert was never very good at, launching a second disciplined cavalry charge and ploughs into the flanks of the surviving Cavalier cavalry and drive them from the battlefield. The Royalists have no cavalry to speak of and are now at the mercy of the parliamentarians. They have a couple of choices: cut and run or stand and fight to the death. Many ran, and who can blame them? But William Cavendish's elite white coat soldiers stood where they were and fought to the death, and were whittled down to 30 survivors. In the space of 2 incredibly intense hours of fighting, the Roundheads had comprehensively defeated the Royalists and their best soldier. Conservative estimates put the Royalist casualties at 3,500 dead, although other sources claim 4,000 were killed, with 1,500 being taken prisoner. The Roundheads lost around about 300 men. Weirdly, the most famous casualty of Master More isn't a human. It was Rupert's pet dog, Boy. Remember him from the last episode? Before the battle, Rupert had tied his dog up, but during the battle, the dog got loose and ran into the middle of the battlefield. Now, this dog was one of the most recognisable dogs and totemic dogs, if he was a Puritan who believed that the dog was a monster. And there he was in the middle of the battlefield looking for his master. Unsurprisingly, he was killed. And in the aftermath of the battle, the Roundheads celebrated the death of Rupert's dog in a pamphlet. And if you remember the pamphlet from the first part of this podcast, where there was a degree of ambiguity as to whether the Roundheads were taking the mick out of Rupert or not, whether they genuinely believed what they were putting in the pamphlet, in this instance, there was no ambiguity. They were definitely mocking Rupert. The pamphlet was called A Dog's Elegy or Rupert's Tears, and it took the form of an invitation to Rupert's dog's funeral. I'll read you a little bit of it. Pretty sensitively worded. Sad Cavaliers, Rupert invites you all that does survive to his dog's funeral. Close mourners are the witch, pope, and devil that much lament your late befallen evil. The one thing that the two pamphlets do have in common is that they both refer to the dog's Catholic allies, which must have further enraged Rupert as he was a Protestant who'd spent his teenage years fighting Catholics. Another interesting thing about the death of Boy the dog is when I tell the story of Master More to school children, no one gives a monkeys about the thousands of humans killed, but everyone gets outraged at the death of Rupert's dog. Go figure. Well, Rupert was stuck in a bean field and he managed to ride away. And even though his halo had massively slipped as a general, he was still a terrifying human being. And it is said that anybody who got in his way on that terrible day, who was of the Roundhead persuasion, was killed on the spot. Rupert managed to get back to Chester and begin the work of building a fresh army to serve his disappointed king. After their incredible one-sided victory at Marston Moor, the war should have gone a lot easier for the Roundheads. But the Roundheads failed to beat the Royalists at the Second Battle of Newbury in October 1644. They didn't lose the battle exactly, it was another draw, but after the amazing victory at Marston Moor, it should really have been an easy victory. Parliament looked for someone to blame, and the blame rested on the shoulders of the commander of the parliamentarian armies, Robert Devereux, the 3rd Earl of Essex. In April 1644, Devereux was sacked, as were a lot of the commanding officers in the parliamentarian army. The law that was passed to do this was called the Self-Denying Ordinance. Parliament decided to start from scratch and create a different kind of army. They took all the elements that worked from Marston Moor and the soldiers responsible for prosecuting them and gave the creation of this brand new fighting force over to 2 Puritan soldiers. One was Oliver Cromwell, obviously, that made sense. But he wasn't given command of the army, that fell to Sir Thomas Fairfax. You remember him, the one that had nearly lost his life at Marston Moor and was forced to flee from the field of battle. Fairfax was a good, tough Yorkshire aristocrat. He'd actually fought for the king during the Bishops' Wars, the wars with Scotland that preceded the British Civil Wars. But he'd fallen out with the king when the king refused to negotiate with Parliament, and there was a little bad blood between the king and Fairfax because the king had actually tried to run Fairfax over with his horse at one stage. In the early years of the Civil War, Fairfax had won battles and lost battles, but had made a reputation for himself harrying the Cavalier forces in the north, and his contributions in the north of England were largely considered responsible for stopping the Cavaliers marching on London for a second time. In October 1643, he combined his talents with those of Oliver Cromwell at the Battle of Winceby, which I've already mentioned, and his contribution aided Cromwell in delivering parliamentarians that victory. Fairfax and Cromwell enacted massive reforms in the way an army was put together. Up to this point, you were more likely to be promoted in the army if you were an aristocrat or a friend of someone in power. But from now on, you would only get a promotion if you'd earned it, irrespective of your social standing. Strict discipline born out of a Puritan religious faith became the glue that held Fairfax and Cromwell's army together. And one of the most radical reforms was they paid their soldiers a wage. It might seem to some of you ridiculous that this didn't happen normally, but it didn't, and often soldiers made their living looting their enemies and plundering nearby towns and villages and cities they had conquered. The name of this new type of fighting force was the New Model Army. When the Cavaliers heard about them, they didn't take them remotely seriously, despite the kicking they'd received by a prototype version of the New Model Army at Marston Moor. And they came up with this hilarious nickname for them. They called it the New Noddle Army. Get it? Hilarious. Actually, despite their public disdain, there was a degree of concern amongst the Royalists about what this new model army might accomplish. Many of the king's military advisors wanted him to attack the new model army while it was still in its infancy. Prince Rupert, who despite his colossal loss at Marston Moor had actually been promoted and had been given overall command of the armies of the king, was reluctant to engage in a hasty battle with the new model army. They would clash eventually with predictably horrible results for Rupert. But before that happened, there was something else that would leave an indelible stain on Rupert's character as well as his reputation. In May 1645, Sir Thomas Fairfax besieged Oxford, the royalist capital. In order to draw Fairfax's army away from Oxford, Rupert was ordered to attack Leicester. Leicester's siege defences were meagre, and they were no match for Rupert and his army. And if you remember from the first part of this podcast, bad blood existed between Rupert and Leicester, and Rupert had his revenge. He allowed his soldiers to run amok among the population of Leicester, and many atrocities were committed, and many civilians were murdered. It's important to say at this point that Rupert had a reputation for allowing his soldiers to massacre people. In 1643, in the Royalist year of victories, Rupert had had a difficult time trying to take Birmingham. He'd been repelled by a small force. And when he got into Birmingham, his soldiers did burn and loot and commit the occasional murder. The Roundheads, always more adept at propaganda than the Royalists, jumped on this and almost certainly inflated and exaggerated the levels of retribution Rupert was said to have visited on Birmingham. What I'm trying to say is that Rupert's reputation for brutality was largely exaggerated, but not in the case of Leicester. Even contemporary historian and Rupert fanboy Charles Spencer agrees that Rupert went too far at Leicester. At Leicester, Rupert was at his most brutal, merciless, unsympathetic, and revolting. But in viciously pragmatic terms, Rupert did the job. In early June 1645, Fairfax, Cromwell, and the New Model Army set out in pursuit of Rupert. The New Model Army began to close the distance between themselves and their enemies. Rupert had always been in favour of travelling north and retaking it for the king. His army at present was small, about 7,000 men, half the size of the New Model Army chasing them. He was reluctant to fight them and risk a second defeat on the scale of Master More. But the king was physically present with his army and wanted to fight. He was worried that if they avoided the New Model Army for too long, his men would lose heart, and their usefulness as a fighting force would be neutered. The king's word outranked Rupert's, and the king decided to turn around and fight. The king refused to listen to Rupert, like he had done when Rupert wanted him to march on London at the beginning of the war. The consequences of ignoring Rupert would be far worse this time round. The Battle of Naseby, was fought on a foggy morning in Northamptonshire on the 14th of June 1645. The Cavalier army were destroyed. Although less costly in human life, it was a bigger defeat than Marston Moor. The strength of the New Model Army was 14,000 and the Royalist army was 7,000. 1,000 Royalist soldiers were killed, 5,000 were taken prisoner, and 1,000 managed to get away. In the scramble to get away from the battlefield, the king was almost captured. Cromwell's cavalry and Fairfax's infantry were terrifying, and the New Model Army, in their debut battle, had completely justified their existence with an extraordinary win. Rupert did have his moment, though. In the beginning of the battle, he launched an extraordinary cavalry charge uphill, not an easy thing to do, and destroyed the enemy cavalry on the western flank of the battlefield. But then guess what he did? He did what he always did in these circumstances and never learned not to do. He chased the enemy cavalry from the field and left the battle, thinking he'd dealt with all of the Roundhead cavalry, not realising that Cromwell and reserves of cavalry were elsewhere on the battlefield and doing damage behind his back. When Rupert came back, he tried to loot the baggage train, unsuccessfully this time, and returned to the battlefield of Naseby to see his army in disarray and defeat. Oh, Rupert, what are you like? On a more sinister note, and a warning, what I'm about to say is genuinely unpleasant. Just to prove that the Cavaliers did not have the monopoly on war crimes and atrocities. In pursuing the fleeing Cavaliers, fanatical Puritan Roundheads murdered over 100 women, who were camp followers of Cavalier soldiers, mistakenly believing that they were Irish Roman Catholics. By rights, the war should have ended there and the king should have sued for peace. For the rest of the fighting, he would be incapable of putting a comparable army in the field. But he carried on fighting. And the rest of the war was largely played out in sieges as one town loyal to the king after the other fell to the unstoppable might of Cromwell and Fairfax and the new model army. What didn't help matters was that the Cavaliers were falling out among themselves. And the worst casualty of this infighting would be Prince Rupert himself. And all those harsh words and undiplomatic dismissals of his peers would come back to haunt him. Both sides were riddled with factions, but the Roundheads were better at dealing with them, as their sacking of the Earl of Essex and forming of the new model army aptly demonstrated. 2 people and 1 further defeat undermined Rupert's possession in the affections and trust and loyalty of the king. Rupert had many enemies within the ranks of the court of King Charles I, but 2 of them would do him real damage. The first was the king's wife, surprisingly, Queen Henrietta Maria, who had adored Rupert when he first came over to meet her back in the 1630s. But Queen Henrietta Maria, an unrepentant, upfront and out there Roman Catholic, had tried to convert Prince Rupert, underestimating the deep-seated resistance to Catholicism in Rupert due to the fact that his family had been kicked out of their home by Catholics. The failure to convert Rupert had led her slowly to mistrust him over the course of the years of civil conflict, and she dripped poison in the king's ear about her. Rupert's second significant Cavalier enemy was Lord George Digby. Digby and Rupert hated each other. Towards the end of the war, the king had favoured Digby's advice, and Digby constantly disagreed with Rupert. It had been Digby more than anybody that had convinced the king to fight the new model army. And as the war entered its final stage, and even Prince Rupert could see that it could not be won and favoured negotiation with Parliament, Digby urged the king to carry on fighting. And it was the king's decision to carry on fighting that saw Rupert, in August 1645, back in Bristol, the city that he had captured for the king, defending it against Fairfax and the besieging new model army. If the king did insist on carrying on fighting the war, then Bristol was a vital city to hold, as it was the only port still in royalist hands, and the only way that they could be resupplied by weapons and supplies, and, if necessary, soldiers from overseas. But Rupert was in a catch-22 situation. Bristol's defences were weak. He was surrounded by the new model army, and the plague had broken out in Bristol. So Thomas Fairfax offered Rupert an out. He offered him honourable terms of surrender, pretty much the exact same terms that Rupert had offered John Meldrum when he'd captured Meldrum's forces outside of Newark. In other words, we'll take your weapons, thank you very much, but you can leave with your men and your colours and your honour intact and live to fight another day. To stay in Bristol would risk death by plague or a possible massacre by Roundhead soldiers if surrender was refused and they were forced to fight a long and protracted siege. Rupert chose the honourable terms of surrender. Fairfax was as good as his word, and Rupert and his men left with their honour intact. It wasn't an ideal situation, but Rupert had surrendered Bristol for the right to fight another day. When the news of Rupert's surrender reached the king and Digby, Digby went to work on the king. Now, the king's confidence in Rupert had been horribly rocked by 2 catastrophic defeats and the gainsaying of Lord Digby. Digby managed to convince the paranoid and blame-averse king that Rupert had taken a bribe of 8,000 gold coins from Fairfax to surrender Bristol to the Roundheads. The king accused Rupert of mutiny, stripped him of his command, and ordered him to leave the country. Not satisfied with this, Digby attempted to draft treason charges against Rupert. Digby, Rupert, and the king were all in Oxford while all of this was playing out. Digby placed Rupert under house arrest and then whisked the king away to bring him to a safe Cavalier garrison, Newark. Whatever the state of Rupert's affairs, he could always count on a retinue of well-armed, seasoned, battle-hardened and extremely violent associates to accompany him. So it was very hard to keep Rupert under house arrest if he didn't want to be under house arrest, so he simply ignored the conditions of his house arrest and left Oxford, and went mob-handed in search of the king and a reckoning with his uncle. Rupert passed through Roundhead-controlled Northamptonshire without getting into a single fight. He ran into some trouble as he crossed Leicestershire. There was a skirmish with Roundhead cavalry at Burley. The cavalry were led by a former royalist turned Roundhead known to Prince Rupert. During the skirmish, the traitor made straight for Rupert and fired his pistol at the prince at point-blank range. The pistol misfired. Had it gone off, it would almost have certainly killed Rupert. But it didn't, and the turncoat immediately surrendered and asked for mercy. The prince, who didn't really have time to take prisoners and didn't like traitors anyway, shot him dead where he stood, with his own pistol, which was in perfect working order. Classic Rupert. Digby knew that Rupert was coming and ordered the king's soldiers to stop him, so at one point Rupert was fighting his way across the East Midlands counties, being hunted by Roundheads and Cavaliers alike. When Prince Rupert entered Newark, the town was in a state of chaos. The king's officers were drunk and nobody seemed to be obeying the king. It was a pitiful sight. Rupert got off his horse and strode into the governor's house where the king was having a meal and interrupted his Royal Highness while he was in the very act of eating. The governor's house where this took place is still there, you know, in Newark. And you know what it is today? Of course you do. It's a Greg's. Really, it is. I'm not making that up. Well, the king ignored Rupert and would only talk to his brother Maurice, who was standing by his side. Well, Rupert carried on talking, insisting on a military trial, a courts-martial to clear his name, which the king agreed to. The trial went ahead and, of course, completely acquitted Prince Rupert of all the charges of treachery and cowardice. It did find him guilty of having unsound judgment, but that wasn't the end of it. The king decided he'd had enough of Newark and wanted to go back to Oxford, but not before he'd sacked the current governor of Newark, Richard Willis, who happened to be a friend of Prince Rupert's, and replaced him with John Bellasyse, who happened to be a friend of Digby's. Well, this led to Rupert storming in once again to have it out with the king while the king was eating. Now, the king was startled. Digby's men were there, and Rupert had brought 20 armed men with him. Somebody drew their sword, and then everybody drew their swords. And in the middle of all of this, the king was looking incredibly angry indeed. And then he screamed blue murder, ordering all of Prince Rupert's men out of his presence. And where was Lord Digby in all of this? He wasn't even there. He'd snuck out of Newark long before Rupert arrived. Mercifully, no blood was shed in the king's presence. Swords were sheathed and everyone was forced to apologise. Rupert and the king tentatively patched up their grievances, but it was obvious that the rift hadn't been completely mended. It was rumoured that the king wept when Rupert left Newark. That was pretty much the end of Rupert's Civil War career. Rupert and the king would patch up their differences for real. Rupert's last engagement in the First Civil War would be to defend Oxford. He would eventually be exiled by the Roundheads, kicked out of the country, and he wouldn't come back until the restoration of King Charles II in 1660. We're going to end the story of Prince Rupert there for the time being. There's more to tell. How he became a pirate, harassing Roundhead Navy. How he fought as a soldier of fortune for the King of France and survived being shot in the head. How he became a scientist and one of the founders of the Royal Society. How he fought the Dutch at sea as an admiral in his cousin King Charles II's navy in some of the bloodiest naval battles of the 17th century. And how he settled down in old age and found love with an actress. Perhaps we'll come back to these stories in another podcast. It's up to you. If you'd like that, let us know using the contact details at the bottom of the Learning From homepage on the National Civil War website. But before we leave Rupert alone, one last postscript. Shortly after Prince Rupert left Newark engaged in its third and longest siege. The most devastating aspect of that siege was an outbreak of the plague. And the irony of that situation is that Rupert's soldiers that had accompanied him to Newark, who'd come from the siege of Bristol, where the plague was rampant, were probably the plague carriers. And so Rupert, who was the great saviour of Newark in 1644, in 1645 accidentally was responsible for killing more people than the Roundheads ever did because of the plague. Classic Rupert. Thank you for listening to this longer than normal episode of 17th Century Tales. Written and presented by an exhausted Adam Nightingale from a secret Nottingham Roundhead location. Next week's episode is going to break with the normal protocol of telling largely cavalier stories. I'm going to be looking at the life and misadventures of the villain of the first siege of Newark, Major General Thomas Ballard, the rubbish Roundhead. For previous episodes and other amazing resources for adults and children to occupy your minds and your brains and your souls in these interesting and difficult times, follow the link below or go to aforementioned Learning From Home page on the National Civil War website. The amazing music, as always, is provided by my brother, Mark Nightingale. Stay safe. See you next time.